At the heart of this story are two couples. Isabella and Russell Hawthorne, both in their early 50s, had been fixtures of the community for over 2 decades. They were the couple everyone looked up to. Successful, well-respected and seemingly happily married. Their home was often the center of neighborhood gatherings. Just 3 houses down, the newly wedded Zara and Eric Donovan had recently moved in. Both in their mid-20s, they brought a youthful energy to the street that had long been dominated by older families and retirees. Their arrival was met with curiosity and warmth by their neighbors, particularly the Hawthornes. Little did anyone know that the lives of these 4 individuals would soon become entangled in a web of desire, obsession, and murder. What began as a daring experiment in sexual exploration would spiral into a nightmare that would leave one dead, one behind bars, and 2 others grappling with the consequences of their choices. This is the story of how a seemingly innocent proposition led to a brutal crime that would be splashed across national headlines and forever change the lives of those involved. It's a cautionary tale of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary seeming individuals and the devastating consequences of stepping outside societal norms. Isabella Hawthorne had always been the golden girl. Growing up in Seattle, she was the captain of her high school cheerleading squad, prom queen, and valedictorian. But Isabella was more than just a pretty face. She had a sharp mind and boundless ambition. She met Russell Hawthorne during her sophomore year at the University of Washington. Russell, 2 years her senior, was the star quarterback with a bright future ahead of him. Their courtship was the stuff of campus legend, the perfect couple that everyone envied. They married shortly after Isabella's graduation, with dreams of conquering the world together. Russell's promising football career was cut short by a knee injury in his first year as a professional player. He pivoted to sports management, quickly climbing the corporate ladder. Isabella, meanwhile, pursued a career in marketing, her creativity and drive making her a rising star in the field. Their move coincided with the birth of their daughter, Lily. They threw themselves into parenthood and their careers with equal fervor. From the outside, they seemed to have it all. Successful careers, a beautiful home and a loving family. But as the years went by, cracks began to appear in their perfect facade. Russell's work kept him away from home for longer stretches, and he began to put on weight, losing the athletic physique that had first attracted Isabella. For her part, Isabella found herself increasingly restless. With Lily away at college, the house felt empty, and her job no longer provided the satisfaction it once did. Isabella began to wonder if this was all there was to life. She started yoga classes and joined a book club, searching for something to fill the growing void she felt. She found herself envying the young couple she saw, with their passionate embraces and carefree laughter. When was the last time she and Russell had shared such moments? Russell, oblivious to his wife's discontent, continued his routine of long hours at the office followed by evenings in front of a TV with a beer in hand. Their conversations became perfunctory, limited to discussions about bills, home maintenance and occasional updates about Lily. As her 50th birthday approached, Isabella felt a growing sense of panic. Was this how she would spend the rest of her life? The woman who had once been voted most likely to succeed, now felt trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. It was in this state of mind that Isabella first laid eyes on Eric Donovan. Young, handsome with a lean swimmer's build, Eric represented everything that was missing from Isabella's life: excitement, passion, and the promise of adventure. For the first time in years, Isabella felt a stirring of desire. As she watched Eric and his young wife Zara move into the neighborhood, an idea began to form in her mind. An idea that would change everything. Zara Donovan, born Zara Khalil, was the daughter of Lebanese immigrants who had settled in Portland 2 decades earlier. Growing up, she had always felt caught between two worlds, the traditional values of her parents and the liberal free-spirited culture of the Pacific Northwest. With her olive skin, Zara stood out in a city that was predominantly white. From a young age, Zara showed a passion for art. Her parents, while supportive, always emphasize the importance of a practical career. As a compromise, Zara studied graphic design at Portland State University, finding a way to merge her creative instincts with a marketable skill. It was during her final year at PSU that Zara met Eric Donovan. She was working on her thesis project at a local coffee shop when Eric, a barista there, struck up a conversation about her sketches. Eric, with his easy charm and boyish good looks, immediately captured Zara's attention. Eric had grown up in a small town in rural Oregon, the youngest of 4 boys in a working-class family. He'd moved to Portland 3 years earlier, drawn by the city's vibrant art scene and progressive culture. While he worked as a barista to pay the bills, his true passion was photography. His Instagram account, filled with moody black and white portraits and stark urban landscapes, had a modest but growing following. Their romance was a whirlwind. Within weeks of their first meeting, Eric and Zara were inseparable. They spent their days exploring Portland's hidden gems, secret gardens, underground art galleries, hole-in-the-wall music venues. Eric introduced Zara to urban exploration, and she in turn taught him about Lebanese cuisine and culture. Zara, Eric represented freedom and self-expression. He encouraged her to pursue her art without compromise, to break free from the expectations of her family and society. With Eric, Zara felt seen and understood in a way she never had before. For Eric, Zara was his muse and his anchor. Her quiet strength and unwavering support gave him the confidence to pursue his photography more seriously. He began to book small gigs, weddings, local band promotional shots, even a few magazine spreads. Their decision to get married came as a surprise to many who knew them. Both sets of parents expressed concern about the speed of their relationship, but Eric and Zara were convinced they had found their soulmates. They had a small ceremony in a sculpture garden, surrounded by their closest friends and family. The move was a practical decision. As freelancers, they needed a space that could serve as both home and studio. The quiet suburb offered affordable housing close enough to the city for work opportunities. They saw it as the perfect place to start their life together, envisioning lazy Sunday mornings in their backyard and cozy evenings planning their future. Little did they know that their new neighborhood held secrets and temptations that would test the strength of their young love. As they unpacked boxes in their new home, neither Eric nor Zara could have imagined the turmoil that lay ahead or the devastating consequences their choices would have. The annual summer block party was a tradition that dated back decades. Every year on the last Saturday of August, Sycamore Lane would transform into a bustling fairground of sorts. Neighbors would bring out grills, coolers full of drinks and folding tables laden with potluck dishes. Children would run around with water guns and bubble wands while adults caught up on neighborhood gossip and sipped cold beers. This year's party held a special significance for the residents of Sycamore Lane. It was the official welcome for the Donovans, the street's newest additions. Isabella Hawthorne, as the unofficial social director of the neighborhood, had taken it upon herself to ensure that Zara and Eric felt welcomed. As the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the street, Isabella made her way to the Donovans, who were standing somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the gathering. "Isabella, you look lovely," Russell called out as she walked past her sundress. Floating around her legs, she flashed him a smile. But her eyes were already fixed on Eric. "Eric and Zara, welcome to the neighborhood," Isabella said warmly. Eric kissing Zara's cheeks and letting her hand linger perhaps a moment too long on Eric's arm. "We're so glad you could join us." The conversation flowed easily, lubricated by the fruity sangria Isabella had brought along. Zara found herself drawn into a discussion about local art galleries with some of the other neighbors, while Eric and Isabella drifted towards the Hawthorns' front yard. "You have a beautiful home," Eric commented, his eyes roving over the house. Isabella beamed with pride. "Why, thank you," she replied. "You should see the inside. We recently renovated the master bathroom. Perhaps I could give you a tour sometime. Get you some ideas for your own place." The flirtatious undertone in Isabella's voice was unmistakable. Eric, slightly taken aback but not displeased, felt a flush creep up his neck. Before he could respond, Russell appeared, clapping a hand on Eric's shoulder. "Hope my wife isn't talking your ear off, son." Russell chuckled. Isabella shot him a look that mixed annoyance and affection. "Actually, she was just offering to show me your renovation," Eric said, his voice slightly strained. As the evening wore on, the two couples found themselves gravitating towards each other. Zara, charmed by Russell's dad jokes and genuine interest in her artwork, found herself relaxing for the first time since moving in. Isabella meanwhile hung on Eric's every word as he described his photography projects. By the time the party wound down, seeds had been planted, seeds of attraction, curiosity, and temptation that would soon grow into something none of them could have anticipated. It was a week after the block party that Isabella first broached the subject with Russell. They were in bed, the TV droning in the background, when Isabella turned to her husband with a mischievous glint in her eye. Isabella broached the subject with Russell one night as they lay in bed. Her voice was casual, but there was an undercurrent of excitement as she asked if he had ever considered spicing up their love life. Russell, half asleep, mumbled incoherently at first. Isabella pressed on, clarifying that she meant specifically in the bedroom. This caught Russell's attention and he became suddenly alert. Cautiously, Russell asked what exactly she had in mind. Isabella took a deep breath before suggesting they try swapping partners with another couple. The silence that followed her proposal was deafening. Russell stared at his wife, trying to determine if she was serious, as he realized she was a mix of emotions played across his face: shock, intrigue, and a hint of arousal. Over the next few days, the Hawthorns had numerous discussions about Isabella's proposition. Russell, initially hesitant, found himself warming to the idea. The thought of being with a younger woman stirred something in him he thought had long since died. It was Isabella who finally suggested the Donovans. They're young, attractive, and new to the area, she reasoned. They might be open to something like this. Approaching the younger couple proved to be a delicate matter. It was at a neighborhood barbecue that Isabella, emboldened by several glasses of wine, pulled Zara aside. The conversation was awkward at first, with Isabella dancing around the subject. But once the proposition was laid out, Zara's reaction surprised her. Instead of outrage or disgust, there was curiosity in the younger woman's eyes. The evening of the swap arrived with a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. The Hawthorns had suggested using their home, citing their finished basement as a perfect, private setting. As Zara and Eric walked up the driveway hand in hand, Zara could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "Are we really doing this?" He squeezed her hand reassuringly, but she could see the apprehension in his eyes as well. Isabella greeted them at the door, her smile a little too bright, her laugh a little too loud. The forced casualness of the situation was palpable as they made small talk over glasses of expensive red wine. Russell busied himself with the stereo, filling the room with soft jazz in an attempt to ease the tension. After what seemed like an eternity of awkward conversation, Isabella finally stood up. "So," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "shall we?" They had agreed beforehand on the pairings. Isabella with Eric, Russell with Zara. As they split off, Zara couldn't help but glance back at Eric, a moment of uncertainty passing between them. But then Eric disappeared. Down the hallway with Isabella, and Zara found herself alone with Russell. Russell led Zara to the guest bedroom, his hand gentle on the small of her back. Despite his earlier bravado, he felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. It had been years since he'd been with anyone other than Isabella. Zara, sensing his hesitation, took the initiative. She reached up and kissed him softly, then more passionately. Russell responded, his hands exploring her young, firm body with growing confidence. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Isabella was living out the fantasy she'd been harboring since she first laid eyes on Eric. His youthful energy and enthusiasm more than made up for any lack of experience. Isabella felt desired, beautiful, alive in a way she hadn't in years. Eric, for his part, was intoxicated by Isabella's confidence and sensuality. As the encounters reached their climax, a series of emotions washed over each participant: excitement, pleasure, guilt, and an unexpected emptiness, all mingled together in a confusing cocktail. Afterwards, as they all reconvened in the living room, an awkward silence fell over the group. The reality of what they had done seemed to hit them all at once. Zara couldn't meet Eric's eyes, focusing instead on smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her dress. Russell cleared his throat several times, but couldn't seem to find any words. Only Isabella seemed truly at ease, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was Eric who finally broke the silence. "Well," he said, his attempt at a casual tone falling flat. "That was something." The tension broke and nervous laughter filled the room. They made stilted small talk for a few more minutes before the Donovans made their excuses and left. Zara and Eric walked home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. They were unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred in their relationships. Back in the Hawthorne house, Isabella hummed to herself as she cleaned up, already thinking about the next time. Russell watched her, a nagging feeling of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. None of them realized that this night was just the beginning. The first step down a path that would lead to obsession, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy. In the days following the swap, life seemed to return to normal, but beneath the surface, changes were brewing, particularly in Eric Donovan. Eric found himself unable to stop thinking about Isabella. The encounter had awakened something in him, a hunger he'd never experienced before. He began to find excuses to be outside when he knew Isabella would be leaving for work. He'd wave, trying to appear casual, but his eyes would linger on her long after she'd driven away. Zara noticed the change in her husband almost immediately. Eric seemed distracted, often lost in thought. When she tried to initiate intimacy, he was either too tired or not in the mood. Their once passionate lovemaking became infrequent and mechanical. One afternoon, Zara came home early from a client meeting to find Eric's photography workspace in disarray. As she began to tidy up, she noticed something odd. Hidden beneath a stack of prints was a folder filled with photos of Isabella. Some were clearly taken from a distance, capturing Isabella gardening, getting her mail, or walking to her car. Others were more intimate, zoomed-in shots through windows. Isabella in various states of undress. Zara felt her stomach churn. This wasn't just a harmless crush or the after-effects of their encounter. This was something much more sinister. Meanwhile, Isabella had begun to notice Eric's increased presence in her daily life. At first, she was flattered by the attention, even reciprocating with flirtatious glances and accidental touches when they'd run into each other. But as the days wore on, Eric's behavior became more erratic and intense. He began sending her messages at all hours, alternating between passionate declarations of love and angry accusations when she didn't respond quickly enough. Isabella tried to let him down gently, explaining that their encounter was a one-time thing. But Eric refused to accept it. One night, Isabella woke to the sound of something hitting her bedroom window. Fearing out, she saw Eric standing in her front yard, a handful of pebbles in his hand. His eyes, wild and unfocused, locked onto hers. "I can't live without you, Isabella," he called out, his voice breaking. "We're meant to be together." Isabella quickly closed the curtains, her heart racing. She woke Russell, who grumbled as he went to confront Eric. By the time Russell made it outside, Eric had disappeared into the night, leaving only a crumpled bouquet of flowers on the front step. As Isabella lay awake that night, she realized with growing horror that her exciting sexual experiment had unleashed something dark and dangerous. She had no idea how right she was or how tragic the consequences would be. Over the next few weeks, Eric's behavior spiraled further out of control. His obsession with Isabella consumed every aspect of his life. He neglected his photography business, spending hours stalking Isabella's social media accounts and driving by her house. Zara watched helplessly as her husband transformed into someone she barely recognized. Isabella, for her part, vacillated between fear and a perverse excitement. Part of her was terrified of Eric's growing instability, but another part, a part she was ashamed to admit existed, was thrilled by his obsessive attention. It made her feel desirable, powerful in a way she hadn't in years. The situation came to a head one afternoon, when Isabella returned home to find Eric sitting in her living room. "How did you get in here?" she gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Eric smiled, a cold, unsettling expression that sent chills down Isabella's spine. "You gave me a key, remember? For watering the plants when you were on vacation." Isabella's mind raced. That had been months ago, before the swap, before everything had gone wrong. She should have asked for it back. Why hadn't she asked for it back? Eric stood, moving towards her with predatory grace. "We need to talk, Isabella," he said, his voice low and intense. "About us, about our future together." Isabella backed away, fumbling for her phone. "There is no us, Eric," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to leave." But Eric kept advancing, his eyes wild with a mixture of love and madness. "You don't mean that," he insisted. "I know you feel what I feel. We're destined to be together, Isabella. I won't let anyone come between us." As Eric reached for her, Isabella let out a scream. The sound seemed to snap Eric out of his trance. He blinked, looking around as if seeing the room for the first time. Without another word, he brushed past Isabella and out the front door. Shaking, Isabella collapsed onto the couch. She knew she should call the police, but what would she say? That she'd willingly slept with her young neighbor, and now he was talking her. The thought of the scandal, of everyone knowing what she'd done, was unbearable. Little did Isabella know, her silence would have devastating consequences. For in his twisted mind, Eric took her failure to report him as a sign of her secret love, and he was determined to eliminate any obstacle standing in their way. No matter the cost, the tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Isabella was alone in her house, Russell having left for a golf game with friends. She was in the kitchen, mindlessly flipping through a magazine, when she heard the back door open. Isabella called out with a trembling voice, asking if it was Eric. There was no response, only the sound of footsteps moving through the house. Her heart racing, Isabella grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it out in front of her like a shield. When Eric appeared in the doorway, his eyes were glazed and unfocused, and he reeked of alcohol. He slurred that he had seen Russell drive away, declaring that now they could be together as they were supposed to be. Isabella pleaded with Eric, telling him he needed help and that this wasn't right, but she couldn't finish her sentence. Eric wasn't listening. He lunged forward, trying to grab Isabella. She shrieked and swung the knife wildly, connecting with Eric's arm and drawing blood. The sight of his own blood seemed to enrage Eric further. He roared and insulted her and charged again. In the ensuing struggle, the knife clattered to the floor. Eric's hands found Isabella's throat, squeezing with terrifying strength. Isabella clawed at his face, gasping for air as her vision began to darken around the edges. In desperation, she brought her knee up sharply, connecting with Eric's groin. The blow caused him to double over in pain, releasing his grip on her throat. Isabella scrambled away, her fingers closing around the handle of the fallen knife. As Eric straightened up, his face contorted with rage, Isabella acted on pure instinct. She thrust the knife forward, feeling it sink into Eric's chest. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Eric looked down at the knife protruding from his body, a look of surprise replacing the anger on his face, then slowly he crumpled to the floor. Isabella stared at Eric's still form. The reality of what she'd done crashing over her. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. The quiet of the community was shattered by the wail of sirens as police cars and an ambulance converged on the Hawthorne residence. Neighbors poured out onto their front lawns, watching in shock as paramedics rushed into the house, only to emerge shortly after, shaking their heads grimly. Detective Liam Reeves, a veteran of the Portland Police Department, arrived on the scene to find a distraught Isabella Hawthorne being questioned by officers. Her hands and clothes were stained with blood, her eyes wild with shock and fear. As Reeves approached, he overheard snippets of Isabella's statement. She was saying that Eric had attacked her, that she had no choice in expressing shock and disbelief at what she had done. Reeves took charge of the scene, ordering a thorough search of the house and surrounding area. While crime scene technicians combed through the kitchen, photographing the bloody knife and the signs of struggle, Reeves turned his attention to the neighbors. Zara Donovan stood at the edge of the police tape, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. Reeves approached her gently, introducing himself as Detective Reeves and confirming that the victim was her husband. Zara nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face. When Reeves pressed her about when she had last seen Eric, Zara managed to choke out that it had been that morning. She explained that Eric had said he was going for a walk, but her voice trailed off as she struggled to process the situation. Unable to continue, she broke down sobbing. Reeves made a note in his pad before moving on to question other neighbors. As he gathered more information, a story began to emerge of a quiet neighborhood rocked by an unthinkable crime. As the body of Eric Donovan was wheeled out on a gurney, covered by a sheet, Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than a simple home invasion gone wrong. The look in Isabella Hawthorne's eyes, a mixture of relief and guilt, told him that unraveling the truth would be a complex and delicate process. In the days following Eric's death, Detective Reeves dove deep into the lives of both the Hawthornes and the Donovans. What he uncovered was a tangled web of secrets and lies that painted a very different picture. From the initial reports of a random break-in, interviews with neighbors revealed whispers of an illicit affair between Isabella and Eric. Cell phone records showed an overwhelming number of calls and messages from Eric to Isabella in the weeks leading up to the incident, many of which had gone unanswered, but it was the discovery of Eric's photography studio that blew the case wide open, hidden among his professional equipment. Detectives found a camera with a high-powered zoom lens and memory cards filled with hundreds of photos of Isabella, many taken without her knowledge. When confronted with this evidence, Zara broke down. Through tears, she revealed the truth about the partner swap and the subsequent obsession that had gripped her husband. She spoke of Eric's erratic behavior, his neglect of their marriage, and her own fears about his mental state. Isabella, faced with the mounting evidence, finally confessed to the full story. She admitted to the affair and the stalking, but maintained that the final confrontation had been self-defense. Russell, devastated by his wife's infidelity, nonetheless stood by her side throughout the ordeal. His Reeves pieced together the events that led to that fatal Sunday afternoon. He was struck by the tragedy of it all. What had begun as a misguided attempt to spice up a stagnant marriage had spiraled into an obsession that caused a young man his life and forever changed the lives of all involved. The case, once thought to be a straightforward home invasion, was now revealed to be a complex tale of desire, betrayal, and deadly obsession. The prosecution painted Isabella as a bored housewife who initiated an affair with a younger man, then killed him to keep her in discretion secret. They emphasized the premeditated nature of her actions, pointing to the convenient absence of her husband on the day of the killing. The defense, led by high-profile attorneys Simone Jeffries, argued passionately that Isabella was a victim of stalking and harassment who acted in self-defense. They presented evidence of Eric's obsessive behavior and called expert witnesses to testify about the psychological impact of stalking on victims. Zara's testimony proved to be a turning point in the trial. Her emotional account of Eric's descent into obsession and her own fear for Isabella's safety swayed many jurors. "She's not the monster they're making her out to be," Zara said through tears. "Eric, he wasn't himself at the end. What happened is a tragedy, but Isabella was as much a victim as anyone in his closing arguments." The prosecutor urged the jury not to be swayed by emotion. "The facts are clear," he insisted. Mrs. Hawthorne made a series of choices that led to this tragic outcome. She must be held accountable. Simone Jeffries in her rebuttal appealed to the jury's sense of empathy. "Put yourself in Isabella's shoes," she implored, terrified, alone, confronted by a man who had been stalking her for weeks. She did what anyone would do. She fought for her life. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. The fate of Isabella Hawthorne and the final judgment on this suburban tragedy now rested in their hands. Isabella Hawthorne was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. As Isabella was led away from the courtroom, the impact of the tragedy on all involved was palpable. Russell Hawthorne, his face haggard from the stress of the trial, watched his wife disappear through the courtroom doors. Despite the revelations of her infidelity, he had stood by her throughout the ordeal. Now he faced the prospect of years alone, grappling with the consequences of their ill-fated experiment. Sir Donovan, widowed and alone, retreated from public life. The trauma of losing Eric and the public exposure of their private lives left deep scars. She threw herself into her art, producing a series of haunting paintings that would later be hailed as a powerful exploration of grief and betrayal. The residents struggled to come to terms with the events that had shattered their peaceful community. The Hawthorne and Donovan houses stood empty, constant reminders of the tragedy that had unfolded. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the memories. Those who stayed found their trust in one another irrevocably altered.